know it's been a long time since my last video here in the Dedicated Astro course, and to make up for that, I wanted to do a full-length workflow like you'd find in my Deep Space course or my Astro Post-Processing course. So today, I'm going to show you how I created this image of the Veil Nebula using my Dedicated Astro camera and narrowband filters. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is head over to DeepSkyStacker, and we're going to of course stack our images. And I should also mention that this was actually my first time doing dithering with my SkyGuider Pro. The ASI Air app has now the option to do right ascension only for dithering, and that's something we're going to be talking about probably in the next video. I just need to do a little bit more testing, but overall, you know, at the very least there's some dithering. But let's open up our picture files, and I took 3-minute long photos. I was shooting in narrowband. I did 20 photos of hydrogen alpha, I did 20 photos of oxygen, and I only got about 3 photos of sulfur because my star tracker died at that point and it was like 3 in the morning, so I just called it a night. And because we only got about 9 minutes worth of sulfur data and it's narrowband, I'm not even going to include it today. We're just going to be doing hydrogen alpha and oxygen, and I think you'll be surprised by what we can turn that into. So I'm going to grab my 20 hydrogen alpha photos. These were taken with the ASI 1600 Pro. It's a monochrome camera with the ZWO narrowband filters. Now that they're loaded in, I'll hit check all over on the left. If I click on one of these, we can move the slider up in the upper right, and it came out fairly well. I took this from my backyard here in Utah, which has really dark skies, but we did have the moon come up. But one of the great things with using narrowband filters is that light pollution and moonlight really doesn't interfere when you're using the narrowband images. So that's pretty cool. Alright, so that's my hydrogen alpha. I also took the next morning my bias and dark frames, so I'm going to grab those as well. Although you could argue if you're dithering, you don't really need to take these necessarily. But with the SkyGuider Pro, since we're only dithering in right ascension, it's not true dithering. Like I said, I still need to do some more tests before I talk about that. But there we go. There's our dark frames. I took 20 of them. And then we've got our bias frames. I took 100 of these. I didn't bother taking flats because, as we've talked about, they're kind of a pain to do on the ASI Air, and I don't have any vignette to deal with anyway, so it's not a concern for me. Now that we've loaded up everything, I've already registered these, so it went through and gave every image a score. So I'll probably go with the highest score here, which is like this image. It looks pretty good. And I'm going to right click on it and use as reference frame. That way, when I stack my oxygen photos as well, it's going to line up all the stars for me, and I don't have to worry about manually lining things, which is one of the problems I ran into way back at the start of the course. So I've set my reference frame. That's a big part of this workflow. Now I can go over to the left where it says register checked pictures. I'm going to uncheck register already just because I've already done this. And it's usually a good idea, rather than stacking 100% of the pictures, maybe do 80 or 90. That way, in case one of the photos was blurry and you didn't catch it, it'll get thrown out and it won't ruin your stack. In my case, I already know it's going to be fine with 100, but I just want to make you guys aware of that. And if we go to the Advanced tab, we want to make sure we always adjust the star detection threshold slider here. By default, it's usually at 10, and then we can hit compute number of detected stars. It's going to analyze the scene. I usually like to get a couple hundred just because I can probably see a couple hundred right there, so that looks fine to me. If you're only finding like 10 stars or you're finding thousands of stars, that's not going to work. So adjust the star detection threshold. The lower the percentage, the more it's going to find in terms of stars. Once you're done with that, we'll go to recommended settings, and we need to choose all these different settings usually. I'm going to do Sigma clipping for my light frames. If these other hyperlinks aren't green, you'll want to click on them so they do turn green for master darks and master bias. Really, that should be all you have to do, and you can hit OK. So we'll give that a go. This is our last chance to look everything over. We'll see that I don't have any flat frames, not a big deal, but I've got my bias, my dark frames, and my light frames for a total of 1 hour of hydrogen alpha. Provided you don't see any red text anywhere besides, in this case, no flats, it should be okay. And then of course we'll hit OK, and it's going to go through and stack everything together. While this is running, one thing I want to mention is that, when you see some of the other guys doing narrowband, they're capturing hours and hours and hours of data for each filter. Usually for me, because of a variety of factors, I'm usually getting 30 minutes to an hour per filter. So it's not a lot of time, but you can still get great images in a short window. That's the thing, the more time you're spending out there capturing these photos, obviously the better the results. But for a lot of us, if we can get even just an hour of data, we can still get a pretty good shot. And that didn't take too long at all, thankfully. So once this finishes loading up here, it doesn't look like much, but that's okay. We'll go over to the left and hit Save Picture to File. I know a lot of people tend to work with those autosave images, but I don't like dealing with them. They're 32-bit files, and you can't really do much with them, and you have to convert them. So you're better off hitting Save Picture to File over on the left, and we'll name this Hydrogen Alpha, whatever you want to name it, and save. Now that we've saved our Hydrogen Alpha stack, we'll go back to Register and Stacking over on the left. And there's better ways of doing this, I'm sure, but this is just the way I've grown used to doing it. So I'm going to click on my first light frame here, go one above this one with a little asterisk, hold down the Shift key and click. If you did that correctly, they'll all be selected. Then I'm going to right click and remove from list. What I'm doing right now is just getting rid of all those Hydrogen Alpha photos. And then I want to uncheck my reference frame, but I want to leave it here. Remember, the one with the little asterisk, that's going to help us align all the stars across all of our filters. So you always want to make sure you keep this one in the stack, but unchecked. You'll also notice I still have all my dark and bias frames in here. That's okay. I only got rid of the Hydrogen Alpha light frames, except for the reference as we talked about. Now what I want to do is go back to Open Picture Files and grab my 20 oxygen frames. And I think I mentioned this, but all of these photos were taken with 3-minute long exposures. So they were each 3 minutes long. The gain was like 200 on the camera. I was using -10 for the sensor temperature, SkyGuider Pro, William Optics SpaceCat telescope. That's what I'm working with. So I right-clicked and checked all of my new oxygen frames, which you see right here. And we still have, again, that Hydrogen Alpha photo. It's not checked, but the reference frame is still here. That way all the oxygen photos line up to it, because things do move pretty substantially over the course of a few hours if you're using a SkyGuider Pro Star Adventure. All right, so there we go. Now we're going to repeat that process. We'll go over to the left, register checked pictures. Again, you're probably better off changing this from 100 to maybe 90 or 80%, but in my case, I know they're all sharp. I'll leave it 100. I already know the star detection threshold at 10 is going to work, so I'll click on Recommended Settings. And again, verify that you have one of these methods selected for your light frames, as well as the bias and dark. It should all pretty much be set from earlier. We'll hit OK. We have another hour here, and then we'll hit OK and repeat that process. Once it's finished, we'll be in this window. We'll hit Save Picture to File, and we would name this one Oxygen, for example. Now that we've got our Hydrogen Alpha and Oxygen, we can close out of here and move over to Adobe Photoshop. Before we head over to Photoshop, though, I want to give you one more look at my final result from earlier. This is going to be our target. And one of the things I love is when you shoot narrowband, you just really pull out all these amazing filaments of the nebula. Whereas with your stock DSLR, you can get a little bit of this bright area, and of course part of this one and this one, but it's just night and day almost when you compare them. All right, so let's open up Photoshop now. And you guys already know this process if you've watched through some of the earlier videos, although I know it's been a long time, so even I myself was a little bit rusty. And we're going to do something different today because we only have Hydrogen Alpha and Oxygen. We're not going to include the sulfur, as I mentioned. So let's go to our directory here. I've got my H Alpha version 2 and my Oxygen version 2. All right, so the way this works is you're going to choose either one of these to be your base. It really doesn't matter. I think I'm going to do oxygen today as my base. So this is my base layer. I'll go to Image, Mode, and right now it's on grayscale, which means we can't do anything with the colors. So let's change it to RGB color. There we go. Now over in the lower right we have our channels tab, and we see we have red, green, and blue. So for this to work properly, if you only have the two colors, and you're doing the Veil Nebula anyway, I'd recommend leaving oxygen on green and blue color channels, and then for the red, that's where we're going to grab our hydrogen alpha. So you can hit Control or Command A, Control or Command C. That'll select everything and copy it. Go back to your oxygen tab, make sure you're on the red color channel, and then we'll hit Control or Command V to paste that data in. That's all there is to it. Now I can click the eyeball for RGB, hit Control or Command D to get rid of the marching ants. Alright, we're ready to go now. Just to recap, we've got hydrogen alpha data for red, and then we're leaving oxygen on green and blue. So that's all we've done so far. We're going to go back to our Layers tab, and now I'm going to add a Levels adjustment. For me, I have a little window up here for my adjustments, so I have it easily accessible. Once this window comes up, you can see we have this little spike way over on the left, and that indicates that most of our image is black. The way we'll fix that is move the midpoint right until we can start to see part of the nebula, and around there. Now, due to a bug in Photoshop, it looks really pixelated right now. So the way I work around that is I hit Control, Shift, Alt, E, all at the same time. Or if you're on a Mac, that's Command, Shift, Option, E. And that will fix the glitch with the pixelation. Now that we've done a basic histogram stretch, we'll do one more. So I'll go back to my levels and add another one. And now we can actually see the two spikes. We've got red and blue. And I'll repeat that process. I'll move the midpoint over to the left and maybe move the black point a little to the right. It's starting to turn out pretty good. Now I'll go back to my adjustments. I could even try one more levels, although there's not much more I can get out of it, so I'm not going to bother. At this stage, when you can finally see the nebula, you've got two options. You can either increase the contrast or fix the color cast. In my case, I'm going to fix the color cast first. The easiest way to do that is to add a curves layer and then click on the black eyedropper. That's going to be the top one of the three. Once you click on the black eyedropper, you'll see a little eyedropper on the screen. Find a point in the sky that should be completely black and click on it. You got a lot of choices usually, so I'm just going to zoom in and say, hey, right over here it should be pitch black, and I'll click. There we go. It fixed the color cast. The problem I have with the black eyedropper is that it also messes with the contrast. So if you go over to the right where it says normal, these are blending modes here. If you click on normal, I recommend putting this to just color at the very bottom of the list, above luminosity. So if you click on color, now that this curve layer is only affecting the color, and you can see it did a really nice job of removing that cyan color cast, which is probably just because we have oxygen data on green and blue. So there we go. That was a fast, easy, effective way to reduce the color cast. If things don't look quite right though, you can always grab that black eyedropper again and just find another spot to choose from, maybe somewhere down over here, and then click. Every time you click, it'll give you something a little bit different. All things considered though, I think that looks pretty good. So we've now fixed the color cast with just one click. Moving on, we'll go back to our adjustments and add another curves layer. This time we're going to focus on the contrast. So you want to make sure you click the hand tool with the two little arrows next to the finger under your curves window. Once you have the hand tool selected, you can pick any portion of the image that you want to edit. So for example, if I want to make this nebula a little bit brighter, I can click on it and drag my mouse upwards. If you look over on the right, you'll notice it added a point and it brought it up. So we've added some light, or boosted it, you could say. Now that we've made the image a little bit brighter, I don't want this sky to get brighter as well. I want that to be darker. So I can click somewhere where it should be dark and drag my mouse down. And that's how we add contrast to the image. That's a really nice change, I'd say. You could even take things further if you'd like. So maybe zoom in down here, click and add a point. But you got to be careful because look what just happened. It had this really weird curve. So you got to be careful when you're working with the hand tool. In this case, I might just drag this point over to merge it with the other one and then manually just bring it up. And then I can also grab this point and just drag it down manually. I want you to also notice that in the upper right of my curves window, there's a flat line, which tells me I'm clipping all the data in the highlights whenever you see a flat line. So if you notice that, you can just click and add a point and then drag that down so there's a nice curve and it's not a flat line. That'll prevent you from blowing out the highlights, especially at such an early stage. And that looks pretty good, I'd say. Let's continue on with our workflow. And I'm going to go back to my adjustments and we'll try one more histogram stretch, just because there's some nice nebulosity in there I don't want to lose. So I'll bring up my midpoint, bring down the black point a little bit. It was subtle, but I think it did a nice job. Alright, so we've already come a long way, but we still have quite a ways to go. From here, I'm going to go to my selective color tool, which is going to be bottom row, second from the right. Selective color is one of the best ways to alter the colors in your image, especially for deep space work. This is something we talk about a lot in my deep space course over on my website. But if you click on selective color, you can choose reds, yellows, greens, cyans, blues, etc. We've got a lot of red and a lot of cyan. So what I'm going to do is zoom in to where I have a lot of cyan, click on the cyan color channel under selective color, and then just move these sliders left and right while I'm looking at the photo to see which direction I want to take the image. And in my case, I want to get more of this blue color rather than cyan. So I'll adjust my sliders as needed. If I think that looks good, I'll zoom out. And I really like that color shift. Before it was too greenish, now it's a lot more blue. I could even double click on the name selective color here for my layer, where it says selective color 1. If I double click on that, I can name this selective color maybe cyans. Because it's always a good idea to name your layers here, that way you don't get confused if you come back to this in a couple months. Probably not a bad idea to rename these as well, like curves 1, that was our color correction. You get the idea. It just helps you stay organized. But now that I've done a basic color adjustment with selective color, I'll go back to my adjustments and add another selective color. This time though, I can target maybe the red color channel. So I'll zoom in where I've got a lot of reds and move my slider left and right. I want to caution you though, because it's very easy to overdo it on the colors, and the more color saturation you add, it's just going to kill the finer detail, especially on an object like the Veil Nebula. So you really got to watch and give a close eye when you're doing this, just so you don't kill the data there. And it's just kind of up to you to have fun with it, move the sliders around, get a color bounce that you like. Alright, so we got our reds. I'm going to go back, add another selective color, and we'll target the blues and the cyans one more time, because maybe I want to get a little bit more of that blue color out of there. I think that looks good. And finally, we'll try the blue color channel. There really wasn't much to begin with, but now we are starting to get some more of the true blues out of it. Yeah. All right. So we're starting to get a good amount of detail here. Once you've gotten the image pretty well developed, where you fix the color cast, you fix the contrast, you've gotten the colors looking pretty good, now I'd probably hit Control-Shift-Alt-E or Command-Shift-Option-E. That's going to create a new layer, in this case layer 2, that has everything we've done up until now combined into one. Alright, so on layer 2, I'm going to go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter. Now what I'd like to do is fix the grain. A lot of people would say fix the grain at the start of the workflow. It's probably not a bad idea, but for me, I usually wait until it's actually an issue, and it probably is right now. So you can see here, I only had an hour of oxygen and an hour of hydrogen alpha. That's not a lot of time for narrowband, and therefore the image is still pretty grainy. So if I would have gotten 2-3 hours and I wasn't shooting only 3-minute long exposures, this probably would have looked a little bit better. That's one of the downsides, but like we talked about, sometimes you don't have all night to photograph. So what we're going to do here in Camera Raw, you've got all these different tabs you can work with. We're going to open up the Detail tab. Then we can increase the noise reduction as well as the color noise reduction. Color noise reduction is going to help out a lot, but both of these have drawbacks, because if I increase the color noise, see how splotchy it is in here? That will smooth out all those splotches by increasing the color noise reduction slider. If you go too far though, you're going to kill the actual color in the photo. So there's always a fine line here. Even just doing a little bit of color noise though will generally help you out. So find the sweet spot, and then after you fix the color noise, you'll probably want to add a little bit of noise reduction. Again, don't go too far though, because you're going to kill all the data. And in my case, I'm just going to do a little bit of each. There we go. The best thing to do, of course, is just capture more data, but in the event you don't, you can always use these sliders. Another nice benefit of Camera Raw is that you have easy sliders here to work with. You can increase the exposure, you can increase the contrast, or decrease the contrast. It's just an easy way for the average person to edit their photos. You don't have to learn all these fancy filters and everything else. You just move some sliders around and they're pretty self-explanatory. So that's one reason I like to use Camera Raw. In my case, I might bring up the whites, even though it is making the stars a lot larger and more bloated. But it's up to you to experiment. Just try different things. You can also adjust the temperature and tint as well. If you still add a little bit of a color cast, this might be an easy way to neutralize it, although there are better options. So just give some of these a try. If you don't like it, you can always revert everything back to start and just focus mainly on your noise reduction and then hit OK. That's looking pretty good there. So there's our before. It was really pretty splotchy in there, and after it's a little bit better. Alright, we're nearing the end of the workflow, I think, but there's a few little things I want to do before we go. The first thing is just flipping everything around, because right now I would say this is actually upside down. So if I click on my crop tool over on the left and we see the bounding box here, I can just rotate everything upside down, and there we go. To me, I think that looks much more visually interesting. Another thing you're going to need to watch out for all the time when you're doing deep space work is that over on your corners, you're going to have some rough edges, because when the software aligns everything, the edges don't look good. So I always recommend, you can see it looks pretty bad on there, when you're cropping things, just make sure you crop out those ugly corners. And if you go to the top left corner on your crop tool, when it's opened up, you can do original ratio, you can do one of the presets. I'd recommend putting it to just ratio though. When you click on just ratio, it might default to like 16:9 or something. If it does, you can hit the clear button. That'll wipe out whatever's in here. And now I'm just going to bring in the corners a little bit to get rid of all that junk. Because I was also cutting it pretty close in terms of my composition. I was at 500mm focal length equivalent with my Space Cat and ASI 1600, so it wasn't the best focal length for this object per se. You usually want either more or less, but it still turned out well. There we go. I've cut out some of the junk around the corners, and then I'll just hit the enter key or the check mark up top. One thing I should mention though, if you look very closely, you'll see it says delete cropped pixels, and that box is unchecked. I'd recommend you do the same. By default, delete crop pixels will be checked, which means every time you crop it, you're deleting all the data that got cropped out. And that means if you ever want to go back and recrop it, you won't be able to, because all that data is just gone forever. So by turning off that check mark for delete crop pixels, you will save the data. That way, if you want to go back and recrop it later, you can. So I'd recommend you do that. But there we go. That's looking pretty good, I'd say. I think the last thing we'll do today is a star reduction. And there's a lot of different ways you can do a star reduction. One of the more interesting that I've seen is something called StarNet++, which is a plugin you can install on your computer and you run your images through it. But for some reason, my CPU isn't supported, I don't think, and I can't get the application to work. So we're going to do it the old-fashioned way here in Photoshop. This is kind of like the standard technique. There's multiple ways of doing this though, but I'll just show you the basic one. For this, we'll go to Select and choose Color Range. And you want to make sure when you're doing this, you're on a new layer. In this case, we're on layer 2. if you didn't have a layer 2 and you're like on selective color or something, this process won't work. So if you didn't go to camera raw yet, now would be the time to hit Control Shift Alt E or Command Shift Option E. You just need a layer here that has everything we've combined, everything we've done now up until now combined into one. That's really critical. So again, we're on layer 2 in this case, and then we'll go to Select, Color, Range. Once you go to Select, Color, Range, the first thing I like to do is down at the very bottom of this pop-up window, you're going to see Selection Preview. It's probably going to be on None. Change that to Grayscale. That way you can see the full image. Now that we're on Selection Preview Grayscale, at the very top of the window, we've got Select Sampled Colors. It always defaults to that. But we want to just choose the highlights, right? Because we just want to affect the stars. Once you have highlights selected, you can move these sliders left and right. The one thing I'd caution you on here is that if you move them too far to select more stars, you're going to pull in the nebula, which you don't want. Really what you're trying to do here is get it so that only the stars are selected, not the nebula itself. And it's hard to do, but try and get it the best you can. Something like that should be okay. If you got it looking pretty good, we'll hit OK. And now the screen's going to freak out because you've got marching ants everywhere, which means all the stars are selected. So I'd recommend you zoom in over the nebula, either one in this case. I'll probably go over here. And if you look closely, you're going to see that there's a little bounding box around all, or at least some of the stars. We need to expand this so it actually encompasses the entire star. To do that, we'll go back up to Select, Modify, and choose Expand. Once you go to Select, Modify, Expand, it's going to come up with this window here. Normally I do 2 pixels, but you might want to try 3. It just depends on your focal length and the star size and everything else. So I'm going to try 3 today and hit OK. There we go. It's now encompassing the entire star. That's what we want to see. Finally, we need to feather the selection a little bit. Again, there's a lot of ways you can do this, but usually the easiest way is to go back up to Select, Modify, and Feather. From here, normally the radius is going to be half of what you just did. In this case, it'd be like 1.5. I don't know if you really have to get that technical with it, but like they say, usually half the value of your expansion we just did in the previous step. So whatever you got to do there, now we have a nice selection around our stars. The only thing left is to apply the filter. And you'll notice here, like, it started to select parts of my nebula, which I don't want. So you could even just get rid of those areas right now. Although I probably wouldn't recommend doing it that way, but you could. If you wanted to do that, I would select the lasso tool over on the left, 3 down. And with the lasso tool selected, if you hold down the Alt or Option key, it should change to a little minus sign next to the lasso. See that? Anyway, with the Alt or Option key held down, you can just click and drag a circle around these little areas and remove them so they're not selected. This is one way to do this. I'd probably just use a layer mask though later on, but I want to at least show you something new today. So again, I'm just going to erase all these areas in the nebula that should not have been selected. That way it doesn't get screwed up here in a minute, and it will get screwed up. So you want to be careful. It's especially important with nebula where you have a lot of detail, like you see here. So that's good enough. I just wanted to show you this technique using the Alt or Option key with the lasso tool to draw out the areas you don't want. So once you've gotten all that fixed up, now we need to apply the filter that's going to remove our stars. I'd recommend at this stage you hit Control or Command H to hide the marching ants so that we can actually see what's going on. Everything's still selected, you just don't have the crazy flashing. After you've hit Control or Command H, zoom back in to your nebula because this is where you're going to see the most problems. Finally, we're ready to apply our filter. There's a lot of filters you could use, but the most common is Filter, Other, Minimum. When you click on Filter, Other, Minimum, it's going to bring up this window here. First thing we normally do is change the preserve from squareness to roundness. That way it's obviously making the stars round. And then you adjust the radius here. This is going to depend entirely on the lens you're using, the focal length, the amount of chromatic aberration, etc. So there's no set number here. Usually the higher you go, the more the stars are going to disappear. But you're going to reach a point where if you go too far, you're going to get ugly dark splotches everywhere. You can kind of see them down over here. So again, your goal is to find the highest number without it turning really ugly. In this case, I can push it further than I normally could. You know, if I'm using one of my telephoto lenses, I can sometimes get up to 2. If I'm using a wide angle lens and doing Milky Way, I can sometimes get up to 0.8. So that's kind of your general range, I would say, is like 0.5 to 2 for your pixels. In this case, I'm going to go higher than normal with 2. And then we'll hit OK. Now what I want you to do is just scan over the image, especially the nebula, and make sure you don't see any ugly, dark, splotchy areas. If things look good, and in my case they do, remember, everything is actually still selected. So if you were to hit Control or Command H, you'd bring back all the marching ants. So this is a really vital step. We have to remember to deselect everything now. So go to Select, Deselect, or Control or Command D. There we go. We've now done our star reduction. And if we do it before and after, that had a pretty profound impact. Before, the stars were just very distracting, and you couldn't even see a lot of the stuff in the middle. And after, you really start to see the beautiful nebulosity there that was hidden by all those bright stars. Now would be the time, though, where I'd probably add a layer mask and paint some of these things out. But that brings up a problem because I got sloppy. For example, if I were to add a layer mask on layer 2 and use a black paintbrush to paint out the nebula, look what happens. It's bringing back not only the stars, which is what we'd expect, but it's making the image more grainy because layer 2 is where we did our noise reduction. So it's always a good idea to separate your layers. So this would be like my noise reduction layer. Then I'd have a layer on top of that for star reduction. In this case, it's all combined into one. So my layer mask technique isn't going to work. That's something you just have to spend a lot of time in Photoshop to really understand what's going on. And again, today I screwed up. So it does happen. The workaround for that would honestly just be to go on your History tab, click above the minimum. That will essentially undo the filter. And then from there, I could create a new layer. But I'd also have to like deselect everything. So it's kind of a pain. This is why you really want to make sure that you're doing this thing in a logical, methodical process. And again, that's something we really focus on in my astrophotography post-processing course and the deep space course. Each one of those has like 15 to 20 hours worth of content, and we really get you comfortable using Photoshop. That way you can do some amazing things with your astro images. Either way though, today I'm just going to leave it, and I'm glad I showed you the lasso tool, because if you screw this up as well, you know, you could just click above minimum and continue to use that lasso tool and say, hey, you know, let me get rid of this area and that. That looks pretty good. So we'll go now down here. We have all this area that was getting selected by mistake. So I'll just use the Alt or Option key, hold that down, drag a circle around it. There we go. I'm deselecting the nebula. That way it's not going to destroy the detail in there. This is probably the best workaround right now, considering I put 2 things on one layer, which, as we discussed, is not a good idea. Anyway, I'm not going to waste your time. This is just a demo today. So there we go. Now that I've removed more of the nebula from the frame, I need to apply my minimum filter again. So I'll go to Filter, Other, Minimum. It remembers the value. There we go. And then I'll hit Control or Command D. And we've now done our star reduction. And so I'll remember for future reference, I'll double click on layer 2 and we'll do noise plus star reduction. Again, ideally you would separate these up into separate layers, but today I made a mistake and I don't want to waste your time undoing it. All right. This is looking pretty darn good, I'd say. We're almost near our reference image. This one's a lot more blue. Looks a lot more nebulous. And the reason that one looks so much more nebulous is because I did one more star reduction. Let me show you that, and then I think we'll call it a day. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-Alt-E. That's going to create a new layer. Again, that's Command-Shift-Option-E if you're on a Mac. And I'll double-click on layer 2 and name this dust, and scratches. It's always good to name your layers and, again, separate these in the separate ones. But from here, let's zoom into our nebula again, and we'll go to Filter, Noise, Dust, and Scratches. When you go to Filter, Noise, Dust, and Scratches, it's going to pull up another window. The way this one works, you want to start with your radius on 1, your threshold on 0. Then you move the radius 1 pixel at a time until all of the junk or the noise or the hot pixels, whatever they are smoothed out. So in my case, 2, it's not really doing it. By 3 though, I think, now they're more or less reduced. You want to keep this number as low as possible. Then you increase the threshold to bring back some of the detail, but you don't want to bring back these weird little halos around the stars. So there's a fine line here. I'd probably leave this, in this case, lower than normal at about 12 to 15. And then we'll hit OK. Now if we zoom out, let's take a look. There's our before. It's still kind of noisy, and after it's much more smoothed out. It almost looks like a painting now. And that's kind of the effect I was going for. I might have lost some of the finer details here, and that is one of the downsides of using dust and scratches, that all these really fine filaments are going to get destroyed in that process. And that's why I don't necessarily recommend doing this. But in my case, from back here, nobody's ever going to know. And I like the look compared to that. So I made a sacrifice. I sacrificed quality for the overall aesthetic of the image, knowing that I'm not going to print this out. If somebody wants to get it printed out, I'm not going to let them, because I know if they look at it on their wall up close, it's going to look like trash. But on Instagram or on Facebook or just the internet in general, it looks pretty good. So you can, of course, choose not to do this. That's fine with me, but you understand my reasoning now, at least, and why I did it. The only thing left is to add in the curves layer. Click on the hand tool, maybe make the nebula a little bit brighter, sky a little bit darker. Yeah, I think it looks pretty cool. And I think we'll call it a day right there. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. It could definitely be a little bit better. We talked about some of the choices I made and why they might not work that well for you and why you probably don't want to do them. But at the very least, from back here, I think that looks like an awesome photo and I'm happy with it. And really, that's all that matters, is that you had fun making the image and you like the final look of it. The last thing I want to mention is that we've been staring at this photo for so long, we're used to the color balance. So I'd recommend, before you post this online, give your eyes a break, go do something else, come back, look at your TIFF file again, and you might notice that, hey, up here it's kind of too red, right? That's something you might not have noticed if you've just been staring at it. So again, give the image some time away from it, come back, and then from here you can do any kind of final color adjustments, which I'm not going to get into. But that's all I got for you today. If you want to learn even more about photo editing and how to take these images, you can either subscribe to my YouTube channel here, or if you want hours and hours of content, you can check out my courses over on my website. I'm currently in the process of updating the Star Adventure full course with all new tutorials. I've gone back, I've redone the SkyGuider Pro course, and then after I complete the Star Adventure course updates, I'm going to be updating my Deep Space course as well. These are always going to be free updates, so if you buy the course, you'll get an email with all the latest content. And it's one of the best ways to learn, so if you liked the video today, I'd recommend checking those out to learn even more about capturing your own amazing images of the night sky.